The poker chips scattered across the saloon floor as Maverick Cordell's fists connected with Jeremiah Blackheart's jaw. Blood splattered onto the sawdust as men scrambled away from the brawling pair, overturning chairs and spilling whiskey in their haste. "You bastard!" Maverick roared, his weathered hands grabbing Blackheart by the collar. "Where is she?" Blackheart spat blood and laughed, his gold teeth glinting in the lamplight. "Too late, Drifter. Sold her contract yesterday to the mining baron up north. 50 head of cattle and a sack of silver, best offer I ever got for that. Pretty little seamstress." The words hit Maverick harder than any physical blow. He'd ridden 3 days straight through Apache territory, his horse near dead beneath him, racing back to Copper Ridge with enough gold to buy Serafina Moonweaver's indentured contract. The woman he'd fallen for during his last stay in town. The one whose gentle touch had mended more than just his torn shirts. Which baron? Maverick's voice dropped to a deadly whisper as his Colt .45 appeared in his hand faster than lightning. The saloon fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Blackheart's eyes widened, but his smirk remained. Cornelius Ravencrest owns half the silver mines in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. You'll never reach her. Cordell, his estate's a fortress, and he's got 50 armed men guarding it. Maverick pressed the barrel against Blackheart's temple. "You sold her, knowing I was coming back, knowing she was waiting for me." "Business is business," Blackheart wheezed. "Girl's got debts from her dead father's gambling. Someone had to pay them." Through the saloon's grimy windows, Maverick could see the dust cloud his desperate ride had kicked up, still settling on Main Street. Every muscle in his body ached, but his heart ached worse. Serafina had waited tables at the boarding house, stitched clothes for the town's women, somehow managed to smile despite the crushing debt that bound her to Blackheart's crooked contracts. The night before he'd left for the goldfields, she'd kissed him behind the church, her cornflower blue, eyes bright with hope. "Come back to me, Maverick," she'd whispered. "Back and we'll start fresh somewhere." Now she belonged to another man. Maverick holstered his weapon and grabbed his saddlebags. The other patrons watched in stunned silence as he counted out. Gold coins onto the poker table, more money than most of them had ever seen. "This is what I owe you for her father's debts," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, "plus interest. The contract's void." Blackheart's greedy eyes fixed on the gold, but he shook his head. "Can't do it, Cordell. Already signed." "The papers with Ravencrest?" "Man like that doesn't take kindly to folks backing out of deals. He'd burn this town down." Maverick's jaw clenched. "Then I'll get her back myself." "You're one man against an army," Blackheart called as Maverick strode toward the swinging doors. "You'll get yourself killed for nothing." Maverick paused at the threshold, his silhouette framed against the dying sunset. "Then I'll die knowing I tried. That's more than you can say about anything in your miserable life." The doors swung shut behind him, leaving the saloon in heavy silence. The mountain trail to Ravencrest's estate wound through treacherous switchbacks and narrow ledges that dropped into bottomless canyons. Maverick's new horse, a sturdy Mustang he'd traded for in the next town, picked its way carefully along the rocky path as storm clouds gathered overhead. 3 days of hard riding had brought him to the edge of Ravencrest's domain. What he saw made his blood run cold. The mansion perched on a plateau like a medieval fortress, surrounded by high stone walls topped with razor wire. Guard towers punctuated the perimeter, and he could see the glint of rifle barrels in the afternoon sun. But it wasn't the fortress that made him despair, it was the wedding. Decorations. White ribbons fluttered from every gate post and window. A large pavilion had been erected in the mansion's courtyard, adorned with flowers that must have cost a fortune to bring up the mountain. Through his spyglass, Maverick could see servants bustling about, preparing for what was obviously going to be a grand celebration. He was too late again. That evening, Maverick made camp in a hidden grove near the estate's outer wall. Close enough to hear the sounds of preparation, but far enough to avoid the patrol routes he'd been studying. As darkness fell, he spotted a familiar figure in one of the mansion's upper windows. Serafina stood silhouetted against the lamplight, her auburn hair cascading over her shoulders. Even from this distance, he could see the dejection in her posture. the way her hand pressed against the glass as if she were trapped behind more than just a window. A rough voice carried across the courtyard, and Maverick saw a tall, imposing figure stride into view below her window. Cornelius Ravencrest was everything Maverick had expected, silver-haired, expensively dressed, and radiating the kind of cold authority that came from never being denied anything. "Tomorrow, my dear?" Ravencrest called up to Seraphine's window, his voice carrying in the thin mountain air. "Tomorrow you'll be my wife, and all your father's debts will be forgotten. You should be grateful I'm offering you such luxury instead of working you to death in my mines." Seraphine's reply was too quiet to hear, but Ravencrest's laughter was sharp and cruel. "Love, child. Love is a luxury for people who can afford it, or you'll learn to appreciate what I can give you." When Ravencrest disappeared back into the mansion, Maverick saw Seraphine's shoulders shake with what he knew were tears. The sight nearly broke him. She was so close, maybe 200 yards away, but she might as well have been on the moon. Then, he noticed something that made his heart race. The window she stood at wasn't barred like the others. It opened onto a narrow stone balcony that connected to what looked like a servant's stairway carved into the rock face. As midnight approached, Maverick began his ascent. The stone was treacherous, weathered smooth by mountain winds and slick. With evening dew, one wrong move would send him tumbling into the abyss below. But he climbed with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. The balcony was 20 feet above him when his boots slipped on loose stone. For a heart-stopping moment, he dangled by his fingertips over the void, the wind whipping at his clothes. Then, somehow, he found purchase and hauled himself up the final stretch. Seraphine's gasp was barely audible as he appeared at her window like a ghost from the night. She pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she struggled with the window latch. "Maverick," she whispered as the window swung open. "You came? I knew you would come." He pulled her into his arms, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender in her hair. For a moment, nothing else existed, not the fortress around them, not the wedding planned for tomorrow, not the impossible odds they faced. "I brought the money," he whispered against her ear. "Enough to pay your debts 10 times over. We can leave tonight." But even as he said it, they both heard the heavy footsteps in the hallway outside her room. Ravencrest's voice boomed through the door. "Seraphina, open this door immediately." "The balcony," Seraphina whispered urgently, but Maverick was already shaking his head. They'd never make it down the cliff face before Ravencrest's men spotted them. The bedroom door shuddered under heavy blows as someone threw their weight against it. "In here," Seraphina grabbed his hand and pulled him toward a massive wardrobe in the corner of the room. They squeezed inside just as the door burst open and Ravencrest stormed in with 3 armed guards. Through the crack in the wardrobe doors, Maverick watched the mining baron's face twist with rage as he surveyed the open window and disheveled bed covers. "Search every room in this wing," Ravencrest snarled. "Someone was here. I heard voices. Could have been the wind. Boss, one guard suggested. These old stones play tricks with sound." "The wind doesn't open windows from the inside, you fool." Ravencrest strode to the balcony and peered down into the darkness. Doubled the guards on all the walls. "If someone's trying to steal my bride, they'll find themselves full of lead."
Ass!
After what felt like hours, the room finally emptied. Seraphina and Maverick remained hidden until they were certain the guards had moved on to other parts of the mansion. "There's another way," Seraphina whispered as they crept out of the wardrobe. "The old mining tunnels. They connect to natural caves that run all through these mountains. My father used to explore them when he worked the silver claims." She led him to a tapestry that concealed a narrow door behind it. Ravencrest doesn't know about this entrance. The original owners used it to hide their valuables during Indian raids. The passage beyond was narrow and pitch black, carved roughly through solid rock. They moved by feel, Seraphine's hand in his as she guided them through turns and forks. That seemed random, but which she navigated with surprising confidence. "How do you know these tunnels so well?" Maverick asked, as they paused in a wider chamber to catch their breath. "I've been planning this escape since the day Ravencrest brought me here," she admitted. "I knew you'd come back, Maverick. I knew. You wouldn't abandon me. So I explored every passage, memorized every route that might lead to freedom." They emerged from the tunnels nearly a mile from the mansion, in a hidden ravine where Maverick's horse waited patiently. Dawn was still hours away, giving them a precious head start before their absence would be discovered. But as Maverick helped Serafina into the saddle, they heard the distant sound of howling that made their blood freeze. It's not wolves, hounds. Ravencrest kept a pack of tracking dogs, and their baying carried clearly through the mountain air. "He knows," Serafina gasped. "He set the dogs on our trail already." Maverick spurred the Mustang into a gallop down the treacherous mountain path. Behind them, the howling grew closer and was joined by the sound of hoofbeats, many riders in hard pursuit. The narrow trail twisted through a forest of pine and aspen, dappled with moonlight that made every shadow a potential threat. Serafina clung to Maverick's back as he pushed the horse harder than was safe on such dangerous ground. A rifle shot cracked through the night, and bark exploded from a tree beside them. Their pursuers were gaining ground. There Serafina pointed, ahead to where the trail forked. "The left path leads to Devil's Canyon. It's treacherous, but there's a rope bridge across the chasm. If we can reach it first and cut the ropes..." Maverick didn't hesitate. He guided the Mustang onto the left fork, just as more shots rang out behind them. The trail grew even narrower, with a sheer drop on one side and vertical rock on the other. One misstep would mean death for all of them. The rope bridge appeared ahead, like something from a nightmare, ancient wooden plank suspended over a chasm so deep its bottom was lost in darkness. The structure swayed in the wind, creaking ominously as they approached. "Can it hold our weight?" Maverick asked, but there was no choice. The sound of pursuit was growing closer by the second. They dismounted and led the horse onto the bridge. Each step made the entire structure sway sickeningly. Halfway across, Serafina looked back and gasped. Torches had appeared at the canyon's edge. Ravencrest himself sat mounted at the head of 20 armed riders, his face a mask of fury in the flickering light. "Cut the ropes," he roared. "If I can't have her, no one can." "Don't you dare." Maverick shouted across the chasm, drawing his Colt .45 as Ravencrest's men raised their rifles. "She's not your property to destroy." Ravencrest's laughter echoed off the canyon walls. "Everything in these mountains belongs to me, Drifter, including her." The first volley of shots splintered the wooden planks around them. Maverick returned fire while pulling Serafina toward the far side of the bridge. But they were still 50 feet from safety when he heard the distinctive whistle of an axe cutting through rope. The bridge lurched violently as one of the main support cables snapped. Serafina screamed as the Mustang lost its footing and tumbled into the abyss, but Maverick caught her hand just as she started to fall. "Hold on," he roared, wrapping his arm around one of the remaining ropes as the bridge swung against the canyon wall with bone-jarring force. More shots rang out from above, but the angle made accurate shooting nearly impossible, hand over hand. Maverick climbed the swaying remnants of the bridge, while Serafina clung to his back. His muscles screamed in protest, and his hands were torn bloody by the rough rope, but he didn't stop until they reached a narrow ledge carved into the canyon wall. "There's a path," Serafina gasped, pointing to what looked like little more than scratches in the rock face. The old miners used it to reach the deeper shafts. They had no choice but to trust it. The ledge was barely wide enough for one person, and it sloped downward into the canyon's depths. Behind them, Ravencrest's furious voice carried on the wind. "We'll find another way across. I want them brought back dead or alive." The path led to a maze of abandoned mine shafts and natural caves. In the darkness, they lost all sense of direction, following tunnel after tunnel in hopes of finding an exit that didn't lead back to Ravencrest's territory. Hours passed before they saw daylight again, emerging from a cave opening concealed behind a waterfall. They were in a hidden valley Maverick had never seen before, lush with grass and dotted with wildflowers. A stream meandered through the center, fed by several springs that bubbled up from the rocky ground. "It's beautiful," Serafina whispered, but Maverick was already studying the valley's exits. There were only Tootha Cave they'd come from, and a narrow pass between two peaks that looked like it might be blocked by snow. "We can't stay here long," he said grimly. "Ravencrest will find this place eventually. He knows these mountains better than anyone." But as they approached the narrow pass, they discovered their worst fears confirmed. Fresh snowfall had created an avalanche that completely blocked the route. They were trapped in paradise, with no way out except back through the caves. That night, they made camp by the stream. Sharing the last of Maverick's provisions while trying to plan their next move, the hidden valley felt like a sanctuary, but they both knew it was actually a beautiful prison. Maybe we could build a life here, Serafina suggested quietly, but even she didn't sound convinced. Wait for the snow to melt in spring. Maverick shook his head. Ravencrest won't give up. He'll send men through every tunnel and cave in these mountains until he finds us, so we don't have enough supplies to last a week, let alone months. As if summoned by their words, the distant sound of dogs baying echoed from the cave entrance. Somehow, Ravencrest's trackers had found their trail. How is that possible? Serafina gasped. We came through water. The scent should have been washed away. Maverick's face was grim as understanding dawned. He's not tracking us. He's tracking something else. He pulled out the small leather pouch where he kept his gold, examining it in the firelight. There, he said, pointing to a tiny scratch on the leather. Ravencrest marked the pouch somehow when I was in his territory. Probably when his men searched my belongings. The baying was getting closer. Soon armed men would emerge from the cave. Entrance, and there would be nowhere left to run. Maverick stood and checked his weapons. Colt .45 and a rifle he'd taken from one of the guards during their escape. Not much against 20 or more armed men, but he'd make them pay dearly for Seraphine's life. There is one way out, Serafina said quietly. She was staring up at the waterfall that concealed the cave entrance. Behind the falls, there's a chimney. In the rock, it leads up to the rim of the canyon. It's a dangerous climb, and ... double quotes, she hesitated. And what? Maverick demanded. And it can only hold one person at a time. We'd have to go separately. The sound of approaching voices echoed from within the cave as Maverick studied the treacherous chimney behind the waterfall. The narrow crack in the rock face rose nearly 200 feet straight up, disappearing into shadows above. You go first, he told Serafina, checking his weapons one final time. I'll hold them off as long as I can, then follow. No. Her voice was firm, despite the tears streaming down her face. We go together, or not at all. Serafina, be reasonable. I've spent my whole life being reasonable. She interrupted fiercely. Reasonable when my father gambled away everything. We owned reasonable when Blackheart made me his indentured servant. Reasonable when Ravencrest bought me like cattle. I won't be reasonable about losing you too. The first torch appeared at the cave entrance, followed by the silhouettes of armed men. Ravencrest's voice boomed across the hidden valley. I know you're here, Drifter. Come out now, and I might let you live to see another sunrise. Maverick grabbed Seraphine's hand and pulled her toward the waterfall. The cascade was powerful, fed by mountain snowmelt that numbed their bodies instantly as they pressed against the rock face behind it. The chimney was even narrower than it had appeared from a distance barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I'll go first, Maverick decided. If I fall, you'll have warning. But as he started to climb, Serafina was right behind him, her fingers finding handholds in the slick rock. They climbed in desperate silence, the sound of the waterfall masking any noise they might make. 50 feet up, Maverick's boots slipped on the wet stone. He slid 10 feet before his fingers found purchase, sending loose rocks tumbling down the chimney. One struck Seraphine's shoulder, but she bit back her cry of pain and kept climbing. Below them, shouts erupted as Ravencrest's men discovered their escape route. Bring rope, someone yelled. They're going up the waterfall. A rifle shot echoed up the chimney, followed by several more. The bullets ricocheted off the narrow walls, filling the air with deadly fragments of lead and stone. 100 feet up, the chimney widened into a small cave. Maverick pulled Serafina inside just as a volley of shots peppered the walls below them. They can't follow us up here, he panted. The chimney's too narrow for men with rifles. But even as he spoke, they heard Ravencrest's voice echoing up. From the valley floor, smoke them out. Build fires at the bottom of the chimney. Soon, acrid smoke began filling the narrow passage. Maverick and Serafina pressed higher, coughing and choking as the toxic fumes grew thicker. The chimney seemed to stretch endlessly upward. Their strength was failing fast. Just when Maverick thought they couldn't climb another foot, he felt cool air on his face. The top of the chimney opened onto a windswept plateau. With the entire valley spread out below them like a map, they collapsed on the rocky ground, gasping in the clean mountain air. But their relief was short-lived. Across the plateau, they could see a line of riders approaching more of Ravencrest's men, who had found another route to the canyon rim. He planned this, Maverick realized grimly. He knew about the chimney. This was all a trap to drive us up here. The riders were only minutes away, and there was nowhere left to run. The plateau ended in sheer cliffs on 3 sides, with the only escape route blocked by approaching enemies. Maverick drew his Colt .45 and checked the remaining bullets. 5 shots left. Not nearly enough, but he'd make them count. "Stay behind me," he told Seraphina, but she was staring at something beyond the approaching riders. "Maverick, look," she whispered. On the far side of the plateau, barely visible in the fading light, was another group of horsemen. But these weren't wearing Ravencrest's colors. Their leader was a massive man with a gray beard and a badge that caught the dying sunlight. "Marshal Ironwood," Seraphina breathed. "From Copper Ridge." 2 groups of riders spotted each other at the same time. Ravencrest's men reined in their horses, uncertain whether to advance or retreat. The marshal's voice carried clearly across the plateau. "Cornelius Ravencrest, you're under arrest for human trafficking, unlawful imprisonment, and attempted murder."
Oh, Ravencrest
Himself appeared among his men, his face twisted with rage. "This is my territory, Marshal. You have no authority here." "Federal warrant," Ironwood replied, holding up an official document. "Your business practices caught the attention of some important people in Washington. Seems buying and selling human beings went out of fashion about 20 years ago." Confrontation that followed was swift and brutal. Ravencrest's men were outnumbered and outgunned by the federal marshals. When the smoke cleared, half of the mining baron's force was dead or wounded, and Ravencrest himself knelt in chains on the rocky ground. Marshal Ironwood rode over to where Maverick and Seraphina waited. His weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "Took us a while to track you folks down," he said. "Lucky thing you left such a clear trail of destruction behind you." 3 months later, Maverick stood on the porch of a small cabin overlooking a green valley where cattle grazed peacefully in the morning sun. The property had cost him most of his gold from the California fields, but it was worth every ounce to see Seraphina tending her garden, her face bright with genuine happiness for the first time since he'd known her. The legal proceedings had taken weeks to sort out. Ravencrest faced federal charges for human trafficking and would spend the rest of his life in prison. His vast estate had been seized by the government, and the money from its sale went to compensating his victims, including Seraphina. But the road to this peaceful morning hadn't been smooth. 2 weeks after Ravencrest's arrest, a group of his former associates had tracked Maverick and Seraphina to the boarding house in Silver Creek, where they were staying. The men claimed Seraphina still owed debts that Ravencrest's imprisonment didn't void, and they weren't interested in legal niceties. The confrontation had been ugly. 3 men lay dead in the dusty street before it was over, and Maverick had taken a bullet in his shoulder that still ached on cold mornings, but it had sent a clear message to anyone else who might have ideas about collecting on old debts. "You're brooding again." Seraphine's voice brought him back to the present. She climbed the porch steps with a basket of vegetables from her garden, her auburn hair catching the sunlight like spun copper. "Just thinking about how we got here," Maverick replied, pulling her close with his good arm. "Sometimes it feels like a dream. The nightmare parts too?" she asked, settling into his lap as they watched their small herd grazing in the distance, especially those. "If I'd arrived in Copper Ridge just 1 day earlier." "But you didn't," she interrupted firmly. "And maybe that was how it was supposed to happen. Maybe we both needed to go through hell to appreciate what we have now." Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Maverick's hand moved instinctively to his gun, but he relaxed when he recognized Marshal Ironwood's distinctive silhouette against the morning sky. "Morning, folks," the marshal called as he reined in his horse at their gate. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Always glad to see you, Marshal," Seraphina replied, though Maverick noticed the slight tension in her voice. Official. Visits usually meant trouble. Ironwood dismounted and walked over to the porch, his expression more serious than usual. Got some news you both need to hear. Ravencrest's dead. Maverick felt Seraphina stiffen in his arms. How? Knife in the back during a prison fight. Happened 3 days ago. Ironwood paused, studying their faces. Thing is, word's already spreading that he left instructions with certain parties about what to do if anything happened to him. Right. Kind of instructions? Maverick asked, though he already suspected the answer. The kind that involves putting bounties on people's heads. Specifically yours and Miss Seraphine's. The peaceful morning suddenly felt fragile, like a soap bubble. About to burst, Seraphine's hand found Maverick's, their fingers interlacing tightly. How much? Maverick's voice was steady, but inside he was calculating distances, routes, and how quickly they could disappear if necessary. $5,000. Each Ironwood's tone was grim. That's enough money to bring every bounty hunter and gun for hire between here and Mexico running. They sat in silence for a moment, watching their cattle graze peacefully, unaware that their owner's world had just tilted dangerously again. We could run, Seraphina said quietly. Change our names, go somewhere far away, could Maverick agreed. Or we could stay and fight. This is our home now. I'm tired of running. Marshal Ironwood nodded approvingly. That's what I was hoping you'd say, because I've got a proposition for you both. He reached into his coat and pulled out 2 silver badges, federal deputy marshal positions. The pay's decent, and it comes with full federal protection. More importantly, it gives you the authority to go after these bounty hunters before they come after you. Maverick stared at the badge, remembering all the times he'd been on the wrong side of the law. You want to make me a lawman? Sometimes it takes someone who knows how outlaws think to catch them, Ironwood replied. And Miss Seraphine's got skills we can use too. She knows these mountain territories better than almost anyone, and she's got a sharp mind for investigating. Seraphina picked up one of the badges, turning it over in her hands. What would we have to do? Clean up the mess Ravencrest left behind. His organization had tentacles reaching into half the territories. Slave traders, claim jumpers, corrupt officials, the whole rotten network needs to be torn down. Ironwood's eyes hardened. And when word gets out that you're federal marshals, most of those bounty hunters will think twice about coming after you. Maverick looked at Seraphina, seeing the same determination in her eyes that had carried her through their escape from Ravencrest's fortress. Most bounty hunters, she said, but not all. No, Ironwood admitted. Not all. This job comes with risks. You'd be painting targets on your backs in a different way. But as Maverick pinned the badge to his shirt, felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose beyond just survival. 6 months into their careers as federal marshals, Maverick and Seraphina had already dismantled 3 major criminal operations connected to Ravencrest's network. Their reputation was growing throughout the territories, but so was the price on their heads. The showdown came on a crisp autumn morning in the town of Redemption Falls. Maverick was checking on their horses at the livery stable when he noticed the unusual number of strangers in town, hard-faced men with tied-down guns, all trying a little too hard to look casual as they positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the settlement. Trouble? Seraphina asked, appearing at his elbow with the same predatory grace she'd developed during their months as law officers. About a dozen of them by my count, Maverick murmured, adjusting his gun belt. Professional killers, from the look of them. The leader emerged from the saloon across the street, a tall, lean man with cold eyes and silver hair. Maverick recognized him from wanted posters. Django Hellstorm, one of the most notorious gunfighters in the West. The bounty on his own head must have reached impressive heights to attract someone of Hellstorm's caliber. Marshal Cordell. Hellstorm called out, his voice carrying easily across the street. I believe you and your lady have something that belongs to my employer. And who might that employer be? Maverick replied, stepping into the middle of the street. Seraphina moved to flank him, her hand resting casually on her weapon. Let's just say certain parties are still interested in collecting on old debts, Hellstorm answered. Nothing personal, you understand, just business. The townspeople had begun to notice the tension, and smart ones were already clearing the streets. But Maverick could see curious faces pressed against windows, and he knew that children and innocent families were hiding behind those walls. "This is federal business," Serafina called out, her badge catching the sunlight. "You're interfering." "With official investigations," Hellstorm laughed coldly. "Federal badges don't stop bullets, sweetheart. Again, there's enough gold on your heads to buy a small town." The moment stretched taut like a bowstring. Maverick counted the visible gunmen, again noting their positions and calculating angles. Too many for a fair fight. But he and Serafina had been in worse situations. Then he heard the sound that changed everything, the distinctive whistle of an approaching train. The noon freight from Denver was pulling into Redemption Falls right, on schedule. And Marshal Ironwood had mentioned he might be on that train, with prisoners being transported to the territorial capital. "You boys picked the wrong day and the wrong town," Maverick said. And Hellstorm's confident smile wavered slightly as he noticed the train. Whistled too, the locomotive rounded the bend with a full head of steam, and Maverick could see the familiar figures of deputy marshals positioned throughout the passenger cars. Ironwood had brought a full squad of federal officers. "It seems like you're a little outnumbered now," Serafina observed sweetly as 20 armed federal marshals began deploying from the train. Hellstorm's cold eyes darted between the approaching lawmen and his own scattered men. Several of the bounty hunters were already backing toward their horses, recognizing a losing proposition when they saw one. "This isn't over," Hellstorm snarled. "Actually it is," Maverick replied calmly. "Gungo Hellstorm, you're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder of federal officers, and about 15 other charges I can think of off the top of my head." The gunfighter's hand moved toward his weapon, but he found himself facing not just Maverick and Serafina, but 20 federal marshals with rifles trained on him. Even Django Hellstorm wasn't foolish enough to buck those odds. The surrender was anticlimactic after all the buildup. Within an hour, Hellstorm and his entire crew were shackled in the train's prisoner car, bound for federal prison. That was the last of Ravencrest's old network. Marshal Ironwood told them as they watched the train disappear toward Denver. "Word will spread fast that the bounties are off. No point in paying for dead men when the organization that wanted them dead is completely dismantled." That evening, Maverick and Serafina sat on their porch again, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Their cattle grazed peacefully in the meadow, and smoke rose from the chimney of their small cabin. "Think we'll ever have a completely peaceful life?" Serafina asked, leaning against his shoulder. "Probably not," Maverick admitted, twirling his marshal's badge between his fingers. "But I'm starting to think peaceful is overrated anyway. As long as we're facing the trouble together." A year later, their first child was born, a daughter with Seraphine's auburn hair and Maverick's stubborn determination. They named her Hope, because she represented everything they'd fought for and everything they'd found in each other. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the baby was sleeping and the cattle were settled for the night, they'd sit on their porch and remember the wild chase through the mountains, the desperate climb up the waterfall chimney, the moment when they'd thought all was lost, but mostly they looked forward to the life they were building together, to the criminals they'd bring to justice as federal marshals, and to the family they were raising in the little cabin overlooking the valley, where their love story had finally found its perfect ending. The drifter had arrived too late to save her from being sold, but his love